And as you all know, one of those previous episodes was a deep dive on money bail that covered its history, hefty toll on the millions caught in its grasp, and the desperate need for reform initiatives. Titled Freedom for Sale, How Money Bail Crushes America's Poor and Inflates the World's Largest Prison State.
To put the issue in context, of the 612,000 Americans currently inside local and state jails throughout the country, more than 75% have not even been convicted for the crimes in which they're charged. And most are there simply because they cannot afford bail. Money bail essentially creates this two-sided, perverted system of justice, right? Wherein those with the funds get out, while those without get stuck behind bars. And of course, this often leads to a loss of unemployment to those locked up, the copping to a plea simply to get out, regardless of whether they were guilty or not of the initial charge, and the untold anguish of not just the inmate, but their families. Pouring salt on this already ghastly wound is the fact that throughout the decades, independent studies have shown more than 90% of defendants released back into society are likely to return to court for subsequent hearings, and those that go to trial are more likely to prove their innocence.
Which leads us to reforms. In April, the New York State Legislature passed long-awaited criminal justice reform measures as part of its overall budget. Among the changes, bail reform statewide that eliminates the use of bail in most misdemeanor and non-violent felony cases. Beginning in January, the far majority of people who enter the criminal justice system in New York will be released on their own recognizance and may participate in pretrial supervision programs funded by each individual county. In serious cases in which bail is permitted, judges must consider a defendant's ability to pay as well as any potential hardships it may impose. The Vera Institute of Justice, which advocates for an end of mass incarceration, said that, quote, if implemented effectively, a conservative estimate of the legislation's impact suggests that New York can expect at least a 40% reduction overall in the state's pretrial jail population. This may also lead to more court cases, given the fact that less people may take a guilty plea. And that brings us to another significant reform, the end of New York's so-called Blindfold Law, which made it difficult for defendants to prepare fully for trial. Under the law, prosecutors will have 15 days to turn over key evidence. The discovery law may also lead to fewer guilty pleas because defendants will have more time to analyze the evidence and assess how strong the case is against them. Currently in New York, 90% of cases end in a guilty plea.
As you'll hear, members of law enforcement are speaking out against bail reform, arguing that it will make communities more dangerous. Yet an analysis of bail in New York City dating back to 1987 shows that it has already been reduced significantly throughout all 5 boroughs. Money bail peaked in New York City at $83,705 in 1987, and in 2018 that number fell to $30,000. So there's definitely a lot to unpack.
Joining us to discuss bail reform in New York State is Alice Fontier, Managing Director of the Criminal Defense Practice at the Bronx Defenders, which defends thousands of low-income Bronx residents each year. Alice, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get to these new laws, can you explain to listeners who haven't been through the system what it's like for someone to be imposed a bail amount that they can't afford and how that impacts their lives?
The simplest way of explaining it is to stop calling it bail and call it jail, because that's what it is. If somebody as a bail is set and they can't afford it, the person is held in jail until their case is over. And that could be anywhere from days to years. And so the impact of being in jail is something that I think most people would understand. You have no access to work, your finances, money, anything that you were doing in your life is completely stopped.
Now, the reform measures adopted by the state legislature are quite expansive. Could you break down what this new law does and perhaps what you most like about it?
The reforms are expansive in written form, but the question of how much of a difference they're going to make in our everyday lives really depends on where you are in New York. In New York City, in only about 25% of cases was money bail being set anyway. So it's not that the majority of people were in and will now be out. In addition, in recent years, there have been the introduction, I should say, of charitable bail funds. So on low-level cases, misdemeanors, where bail was set at $2,000 or less, charitable bail funds were paying people's bail. So they were not in jail anyway. That doesn't exist outside of the city and in upstate. So in some places, people were being held in on as little as $500 that their families could not afford to pay on misdemeanors, things like driving without a license. That's something that you could be held in jail on if you were in front of the wrong judge in the wrong place. And if your family couldn't afford it, you sat in jail trying to resolve your case. So what the bail reforms do is take away that option from judges on very low level offenses, misdemeanors, almost all misdemeanors, and then on most nonviolent felonies as well. So there's a lot less discretion on the judge's part to be able to set money bail.
I just want to piggyback off of that because the rate of money bail has largely, as you said, declined across New York City since its peak in the late 1980s. So in a way, bail reform has been happening, I guess, organically. So what are the different factors other than the bail funds, which is significant, that led to this point?
So it's been a long time coming, as you say. We have really, I think, changed for the better as a society where we're not saying, on the basis of an accusation alone, you should be locked away until further notice. But also that only ever applied to people who are poor, which, again, just enhances the cycle of poverty that makes everything worse. But, as a society, we've been coming to the realization that mass incarceration isn't working, that we aren't safer and that communities are destroyed. And so the reforms that are happening are not, a lightning bolt revolution, but are the product of a lot of societal change. And as you said, in New York City and other places, there was a realization that money bail was unfair and that only poor people were suffering the fate of these laws. And so through organic forces, society plus district attorneys plus judges, it was being used less and less.
Thanks, Alice. If we could now talk a little bit about this backlash these reforms have received over the last several weeks. I guess law enforcement groups and unions are sounding the alarm. The president of the Sergeants Benevolent Association said bail reform would put citizens and police officers in harm's way, comparing it to the movie The Purge. What do you make of this reaction?
It's last minute fear mongering and nothing more. The fact of the matter is that, a more liberal, more progressive bail bill passed the legislature, passed the assembly the year before. These bills have been through many committees. The prosecutors and sheriffs raised their fears in Albany. The legislatures heard them and they put in safeguards. Violent felonies, you can still set money bail. Remand is an option for, the most serious cases. And then there are other safeguards like protective orders for people in saying, you may have no contact with that person, but also protective orders with the discovery that is also going to be produced. And then they're expanding supervised release and other supportive programs to make sure that people actually are getting what they need in order to be able to come back to court and not to commit new offenses. So, it is just fear mongering and nothing more, because there is a realization that, we are taking a significant step towards ending mass incarceration in New York.
So you referred to that sort of late stage fear mongering. We also have Republican lawmakers who have introduced measures to try to scale back the law, including one that would allow judges to decide if a defendant should be held based on their perceived threat to public safety. And New York, as you know, for all its criminal justice ills over the last several decades, has prohibited judges from holding people based on the so-called public safety provision. So why is that important?
It's very important because, if you don't really dig into it, that makes inherent sense that a judge would be able to say, I think this person is a danger and therefore I'm going to hold them in jail. However, how does a judge make that decision? What do they use to predict somebody's future behavior. The rate of recommission of violent offenses is incredibly low. It's less than 2% of people who commit a violent offense and then commit another violent act. So it is just based on other factors that a judge would decide, I think you're dangerous if you're not charged with a violent offense. If you're charged with misdemeanors or, some, non-violent felony, and a judge looks at you and says, I think you're dangerous, then they can set bail. That simply doesn't make sense. Judges don't have the, future predictive power to decide that somebody is in fact likely to commit another offense.
And one of the other important factors in this is that counties are going to have to finance some of these measures on their own. So, what do you see coming out of that? Do you see any problems with counties proclaiming that they don't have the funds for this?
New York is interesting because the funding for much of this is county by county, and things have been operating that way for a long time. There's no statewide set system. Take New York City, for example. The city comptroller just issued a report that found that it costs $925 per day per person to keep somebody in jail in New York City. That's a total of over $337,000 per year per person. If that money is reallocated, it's going to be an enormous savings. Closing jail facilities, reallocating the money will actually result in savings as opposed to costing counties money.
All right, Al. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all unfolds. I wish you guys luck at the Bronx Defenders, continuing what you guys do to help low-income residents. And we appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And, we're very, very excited and think this is a absolute turn for the best and for, people that do face the criminal legal system.